Okay, great. So, and we've opened up our webinar today more broadly than the traditional community of practice, which our current community of practice comes from existing funded High Road Training Partnership Initiative programs. But we've opened that up a little bit more broadly to folks who are developing high road partnerships, and folks, I think we've got some folks from different state agencies who are incorporating high road principles into their work as well. So welcome everybody to this expanded community of practice. So today's topic is HRTP 101. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, see if I do this correctly here. And HRTP 101 is going to be pretty conceptual. It's going to be, can folks see a screen now that says HRTP 101 framework and principles?
Yes.
Super. Thank you very much. Okay. We're going to take a quick look in today's conversation at the history and foundational principles of high road partnerships. We'll explore some sort of building blocks for a high road theory of change. We'll discuss demand side and supply side strategies that are incorporated in and speak to how high road work changes markets and by balancing power. And we want this to be a really welcoming space where folks can ask questions and get clarification. And as I said, it's a lot of conceptual stuff. So I'm going to pause from time to time and open the floor up for questions. Feel free to go ahead and put questions as they occur to you in the chat. And then when we take those pause breaks, we'll try to address those questions and also questions from the group. Okay, so that's where we're going to get started here. All right. So for more than 25 years, economists, workforce development practitioners, worker advocates, like many of you on the phone, have been making a distinction between high road and low road as it relates to jobs, economic systems, and even competitive strategies, right? And back as far in the 90s, for example, economists William Milberg and Ellen Houston distinguished between high road and low road strategies for US competitiveness, or actually for global international competitiveness, in the face of what was then increasing global capital mobility. And they described these as above, or as on this sheet, on this slide. They described a low road as one that emphasizes cost cutting, conflictual labor relationships, and a narrow set of social programs, and not a lot of support for individual workers and communities or groups of workers and communities. And they contrasted that with a high road approach that requires a rapid productivity growth and innovation that is based on cooperative labor relations, generally stronger and more centralized labor unions, high quality production, higher wages, and greater state-supported social protection. So a more sort of holistic approach that creates different outcomes for workers and communities as well as businesses. In 2000, 22 years ago now, the AFL-CIO's Working for America Institute published the High Road Partnerships Report. And in that report, they highlighted 14 high road partnerships that were working at that time in a wide range of industries: healthcare, hospitality, transportation, manufacturing, and construction. And of course, we have all of those industries operating high road partnerships in California today. And in that report, high road partnerships were described this way. The partnerships vary in structure. They employ different strategies and have different funding sources, but they share a common broad goal. That is to build an economy, and we'll hear sort of a similar thread here, based on skills, innovation, opportunity, sustainability, and equitably shared prosperity, rather than low road practices that lower living and working standards and weaken communities. So we're seeing a thread here as we talk about high road and low road. So if we fast forward to 2017, the California Workforce Development Board launched the High Roads Initiative. And the goal of that initiative was to foster partnerships between industries, employers, labor, and workers to advance a just economy with a focus on equity, climate resilience, and job quality, the ECJ principles, right? So again, themes that are pushing up quality of life for communities, healthy communities, across measurements of equity, climate resilience, and job quality through partnerships between industries, employer, labor, and workers. Building toward a just economy. And that initiative is really critical. It's really the leading initiative, I think, in the country, and it's the place, the first place I've seen, or the best place I've seen over, doing this work myself for about 30 years, where there's been this kind of concentrated investment in the foundations and the development of high road work across sectors, and now moving into regional approaches. So it's really, really very exciting. And I think this is the entire nation is looking to California to see how to do this work. And California is really leading the way in developing that. Starting with an initial cadre of 8 high road partnerships, the Workforce Board partnered with labor centers at UCLA and UC Berkeley, the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, another key player in high road over the last many years, a group of key high road experts that have been practitioners that have been doing this work for some time. And they convened the 8 partners identified in the initial cadre. Most of these were mature partnerships, and sat down together to identify the essential elements of high road partnerships. What are we talking about here, and why do they work? And they came up with 4 essential elements of a high road framework: worker management leadership, intentional partnership, worker voice, and industry-led solutions. So let's take a moment and we'll kind of dig into what that means. High road partnerships are what we call industry-led. And when we define industry, when we talk about high road, we're talking about both the workers who do the work and the employers who manage and own the work. So industry isn't used as employers or a sector. It's actually the workers and managers and owners in that sector. So these partnerships are industry-led, and their foundation requires a real deep and practical knowledge of things like the job functions, career paths, the industry structure and dynamics. How does it work? How does competition work in the industry? How is it structured? The workplace context. What is it like to be on the shop floor on a day-to-day basis? How do relationships work? How does power work? And also the communities where the work is performed. The resources available in the community, the impact of the employer on the community, all of these pieces. And that information comes from, again, both the workers who do the jobs and the employers who manage the work. This is not theoretical or commodified. This is really located where real jobs are, real work, real workers, and real communities. Intentional partnership, the second essential element, is about the fact that high road partnerships make the work of partnership itself a priority. That means that the work requires sustained attention to building mechanisms, structures, processes, investing resources that engage partners regularly, build trust, resolve conflict, because oftentimes, always in fact, partners have competing interests, right? Their interests don't 100% overlap. So there's got to be a way to figure that out, resolve conflict, and address those competing interests. Identify problems and opportunities, and then together, through that shared partnership, they can craft solutions that benefit all partners at the table. Worker voice and worker wisdom are a key essential element to high road workforce partnerships. In fact, partnerships really rely on worker wisdom. They both require strong worker voice structures, and they enhance strong worker voice structures by supporting workers in building the skills necessary to self-advocate and to advocate collectively, to understand their industries and to bring their wisdom to the table. And they share power together. Resources and power around governance of high road partnerships are shared. And that way, this infrastructure can address the realities of both the demand side, the jobs and workplaces side, and the supply side, the workers and communities side of our workforce needs. Okay. And then the fourth essential element that the initial 8 partners identified was that solutions in high road partnerships are industry-led. Again, remembering that industry means workers and employers, and that's who drives training solutions, and in fact, solutions beyond only training. What that means is that high road partnerships are sustained and industry-led structures, or we can say infrastructures, that drive holistic responses to very specific and also systemic workforce challenges, changes, and opportunities. So rather than merely training individuals with an off-the-shelf kind of a generic training to fit sort of a generic job description or a generic identified need, high road partnerships bring people together to use their deep industry knowledge, those intentional processes that we talked about, and that worker wisdom to design holistic solutions, bring outside resources to bear when appropriate, reach out to subject matter experts, education systems, and bring those in when necessary or appropriate, or develop internal resources as well that are part of that sustained infrastructure. Okay. So those are the 4, sort of a deeper dive into the 4 essential elements. Let me take a moment here and pause and see if there are any questions. Do we have any questions in the chat? Anybody want to raise their hand? And Andrew and Karina, can you help me with identifying any questions in the chat, as I've got multiple screens going here?
Okay, I don't see anything. So if anyone, yeah, you can raise your hand or come off mute.
Okay.
Oh, someone mentioned about showing an example, and if that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So they're hard to choose. One example was just discussed in a presentation to the Workforce Board earlier today from the Shirley Ware Education Center and the Ed Fund operating in healthcare. That's a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and SEIU unions, and that represent workers in those healthcare facilities. That's a long-standing labor management partnership that was one of the original 8 projects funded by the High Road Initiative. And because of the infrastructure that workers and managers have developed over many, many years in that sector, with additional support from the High Road Partnership Initiative, when COVID hit, for example, that partnership was able to pivot very quickly and develop solutions that were not only training solutions, but that were even broader solutions to what was happening in the industry at that time. So they supported the ability to upskill workers into positions that were needed in healthcare as a result of the pandemic and as a result of just the pressure on healthcare generally. They were able to quickly develop approaches that helped more people get online when we were all moved into lockdown space. A variety of interventions were developed because they had that infrastructure that allowed them to sit together at the table and pivot to respond very quickly, kind of at the speed of business, to the challenges that the industry was facing. So that's just one of many examples. Okay. So you can sort of see that there have been a variety of iterations and permutations of how we use this term high road over the last 20 to 30 years. And there's no real cookie cutter definition of a high road job, a high road partnership, or a high road project, in part because they take place, as we said, in real workplaces in real time and must be customized to the time and place. But even though there's no sort of single definition, we sort of know one when we see one, right? We know, we get it, we have an instinct that says that's high road work. And I think that's because these projects and partnerships evidence a common approach to change that culminates in a goal of shared prosperity and shared responsibility. What I've learned as a practitioner, a high road practitioner, and from working with, learning about, and learning from high road practitioners and partnerships over the last 30 years is that the high road change process starts from a position of shared power between the people who do the work, as we said, and the people who control the work. And then that relationship builds into engaged partnership and robust infrastructure. And that then starts to push us toward these equitably shared resources, benefits, and burdens. Okay. Again, equitably shared power moving into engaged partnership and effective infrastructure, leading to more equitably shared resources, benefits, and burdens. And it's not something that's quick and easy. It really takes long-term commitment and investment. Okay. Let's take a moment just to think about what we mean by equitably shared resources, benefits, and burdens. I tend to think about resources as sort of the necessary inputs, the things that we need to have in order to create successful economic structures and healthy communities. Education, transportation, childcare, the variety of things that all of us need to build that healthy community through our efforts to create products and services. I put in the benefits bucket, I tend to put things like the pay, wages, disposable income, the ability to have economic stability for families and communities. And then there's the burden part of it. That's something that I don't think is talked about quite as much. Does anybody have a suggestion as to what we might mean when we talk about the burdens related to producing goods and services, or burdens related to work? Anybody want to chime in with an idea? Phyllis, I see a hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is really fascinating and sort of like turning it all over in my head, but I'm thinking about things like a separate call yesterday, we were sort of talking about this idea of, hackers' idea of like a risk shift, sort of occurring somewhere around, the 1980s, and this kind of idea of, the onus having been put increasingly on like workers in terms of like assembling adequate work hours, things like this, which kind of like devolve or, kind of takes that burden of maybe having an employee and, paying someone when the work isn't needed, off of employers. So, I mean, obviously, I guess more of a shared burden would be, a realization that like employers have to sort of be on board to, rather than sort of putting that burden solely on workers, maybe more of a sort of return to some, employment model where employers are perhaps more committed to taking on that burden of, having workers, even if their labor isn't, necessarily needed in every, in the moment, rather than sort of having that burden, that onus kind of shifted onto workers. I guess a second example that's a little bit more of a sort of burden sharing might be kind of addressing, I would think, addressing some of the challenges that come with, with climate change and sort of moving to low carbon, approaches, methods that I can imagine put, potential burden both on employers and workers, sort of ensuring that burden is more shared. So those are kind of two things I can think about, is kind of in a sort of employment model kind of overall, and then kind of perhaps addressing some sort of looming climate challenges.
That's exactly what we mean. That's exactly what we mean when we think about those kinds of burdens. Really great examples. And also an example of, if you want to know how to do the work, ask the people who do the work, the folks on this call, folks like you who work in this space, coming up with those examples. So thank you for that. Yeah, that's exactly right. And as you point out, in the environmental space, things like who has to live in the community that is affected by the pollution produced by who has to live there, and who is living in a community that's less affected by the effects of our work. And we sort of know what that looks like, right? So you're exactly right. And the notion of economic sustainability, right? It still costs the same to raise your family, whether you're getting 10 hours a week or whether you're getting 30 hours a week. And what does that mean? Who bears the burden of making sure that there is a healthy community of workers that's available to do that work, right? Excellent approach. Thanks very much. Great. So that's where we're looking at when we think about these high road pieces. So conversely, it's probably responsible to take a look, well then, what does that say about what the low road is? And the low road then starts with a unequal power. And as a result of that unequal power, because there is no shared power, then no real partnership can exist, right? Because folks don't have the ability to actually advocate for their needs and roles in the partnership without some sort of power that they bring to the table. That results typically in a disconnected infrastructure around work, if there's one at all. Sometimes there's no infrastructure at all, or the infrastructure that is inadequate to really meet the needs. And then that leads us to an unequal distribution of resources, benefits, and burdens. So just the opposite in a low road picture. Okay, so we can think of it sort of as a continuum, right? There are jobs, segments of industries, workforce projects that can fit at various points along the continuum. So let's stop and see if this makes sense to all of you. First, let's start by Karina. Can you run? Karina's going to run a poll. First, let's ask: is this a worthy goal? Should we be aiming for communities and labor markets where resources, benefits, and burdens are equitably shared? So, Karina, do you want to go ahead and put up that poll? So this is just a yes or no. Vote off the top of your head. Does it? Okay. Got some votes. Votes coming in. All right. Terrific. Okay, so it looks like most folks are landing in the yes category. Does whoever voted no want to comment? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but you're more than welcome to offer a critique. And if I can't see your hand, feel free just to open your microphone. Okay. Okay. Well, most of us are landing in the yes column. Okay, so let's sort of assume for today's purposes that we think that aiming for this is a worthy goal. Okay, and then let's ask a second question. Where would we put the U.S. economy on this spectrum? And as you continue to do your work after this call, I'd invite you to think about where you'd locate your community or the work you do on this spectrum. But where would you put where would you locate the U.S. economy on the spectrum, with 10 being fully equitably shared power and 1 being absolutely unequal power? Okay. So getting a lot of 2s and 3s, few 1s, few 4, some 4s, 5s, and 6s. So 110, or it looks like 110. Okay. Okay, great. So again, let me open it up if anybody wants to comment on why they chose what they chose. Don't want to put anybody on the spot. Looks like, Phyllis?
Sorry, I don't want to dominate that, but I think it's very interesting. I think, I think I put like, maybe it's a little low. I think I put like a 4, just because, it's not, there are sort of some levels, there are some, labor protections that are enshrined in law. I think though, but unionization is relatively low in private sector. I think the thing that occurs to me, though, I'm just kind of curious about this. I mean, when I think about this, I wonder that I think there may be some differences in terms of I think that the levels of sort of power, sort of equitable, sharing of you know, sorry, I think it's a little bit, you know, there are sort of lower, perhaps, you know, sort of higher skilled or higher status jobs, you know, are perhaps a little bit more, I think there's a little bit of inequitable sort of distribution and sort of, like, I don't think it's quite the same, you know, across the board for sort of all workers, all employers. And when you were talking a little while ago about this idea of, you know, shared burdens, I think sometimes a little bit, you know, almost like a creative extension of this sort of Esping Anderson's idea of like decommodification or sort of relative commodification. And it occurs to me that, you know, I wonder how much sort of white collar workers who, you know, may typically sort of have access to sort of employer provided benefits, you know, things of that nature, in part just because their labor sort of commands, you know, higher, is more specialized and sort of commands more power, are already a bit more sort of, you know, have the benefit of some of that employer willingness to sort of, you know, take care of their needs in the absence of like an immediate need for their labor, you know, versus other kinds of employment where there's a bit of a higher turnover model and a lot of sort of lower status or you know, lower skilled jobs. So I wonder if that distribution of power is sort of itself inequitably distributed across sort of different levels of worker, different sort of types of employment, in your view? I'm sorry, that was much longer winded than I meant to be.
No, that's really,
me.
not at all. That's really excellent. And thanks for putting yourself out there to sort of stir up and support the conversation in that perfect way. I think that's yes, I think you point out something that's wrong with the question, right? Is that the economy isn't experienced the same by everybody, right? And so absolutely, that the answer to that question is different depending on sort of where and who you are and where you're located, and for a variety of reasons that I think make it makes a lot of sense to dive into, and that diving into that itself is part of high road work to try to figure that out and figure out what that looks like in particular times and spaces so that we can make change, right? So yeah, I absolutely appreciate your question. And Blanca, did I see your hand up?
I just wanted to clarify the 10 was accidental.
Oh, okay. It was a surprise. Good for you. Good for you. Okay, great. So again, thanks to both of you for your input there. Okay. So let's go ahead and move forward from our check-in here. And so for the most part, we said that equitably shared resources, benefits, and burdens is a worthy goal that we should be pursuing. And we also sort of located ourselves generally toward somewhere around here in the on the continuum of if we're high road right, you know, today, with some really great points from Phyllis around kind of depends on where you're sitting, right? Some people might be further up here, and some jobs might be further up here, some groups of people, and some might be much closer to this unequal power. So given that as a context, we start to ask the question, then how do we move up the continuum? Well, if our current system is based on what we think is trending toward unequal power, that's leading us down this path, and we want to start to move up here, but we start with power. Let's pause for a moment and take a look at what we think about power. Okay, let's come up with kind of a working definition of power. And there's a myriad of ways to think about power and to talk about power in this context and a variety of contexts. But let's start with just thinking of power as if it's the ability to act or produce an effect, the possession of control, authority, or influence over others, the authority and capacity to direct or influence in a particular way. If we start there, then we think about, well, then what does that mean for power in the labor market? The working definition that I sort of fall back on is, for workers, that means power is the authority and capacity that's derived from or connected to one's work or one's role as a worker to direct or influence the bucket of things that affect my quality of life, the health of the industry where I work, and the health of the community where my family and I work and live. Okay. And that bucket of things, resources, conditions, and systems, what authority and capacity do I have to influence them that is derived from my work or connected to my work? And for employers, then the same is the case. Whoops, sorry. What authority and capacity do I derive from my ownership or management of work or my connection to work that influences that bucket of things, people, resources, conditions, systems that affect my quality of life, the health of the industry where I work, and the community where I work and live, right? What's my authority and capacity to influence that? So that's kind of the working definition that I'm using as I think about this. Again, we could have a whole other conversation about how to talk about power, and there are other equally as good or probably better ways to do that, but I just want to locate that here. So then if we go back to our observations about how effective high road workforce partnerships operate, then we begin to see some common elements that can inform our understanding and help us start to develop a broad theory about how high road partnerships make change, right? For today's purposes, I'm going to borrow what I think is a fairly concise definition of theory of change from the Theory of Change Institute. They call it a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. So note that it is in a particular context. So a high road theory of change isn't going to be prescriptive. It must be this always this one thing, and it's not necessarily time bound. By that, what I mean is specific projects or specific regions, specific sectors, specific partnerships are going to have their individual theories of change that are going to be based on the context in which they're working. And as we in the community of practice expand our work and deepen our work, and as the field evolves, we'll keep learning and adapting, and especially the middle of our theory of change, the assumptions, the indicators, the interventions, and the benchmarks are going to continue to develop as well. But I think these basic elements of a high road theory of change show up consistently in effective partnerships. In my experience, and this is just one person's experience, the change process that's working in successful high road partnerships has often begun independently of the public workforce system, for example. It's not somebody says, okay, here's some money, go develop a high road partnership. What's happened is more like partnerships have begun in a union context, or in a worker center context, or in a coalition of community organizations that are already doing significant work toward balancing power, certainly toward analyzing power discrepancies, benefits discrepancies, burden discrepancies, and bringing that forth in a powerful way. And then high road partnerships often develop out of those. Okay. So specifically, if we sort of start with that kind of broad framework around how these partnerships make change, let's look a little bit more specifically at some of the steps that we often use. We tend to start with analysis, right? We spend time investigating job quality, power relationships, things like climate impact, equity status, community needs, variety of work adjacent infrastructure. We look at industry life cycles, trends, impacts that particular firms or sectors have, needs and interests and impacts on a particular population or a geographic region that we want to affect. So we start with that analysis, and in that analysis, we identify decision points, right? Where are the decisions being made about resources? Who makes the decisions? Where are they made about value, what a particular job is worth? Priorities, who gets access to what? Where are those decisions made and who makes them? I investigate that, find out about that, learn about that, again, from the perspective of the workers who do the work, people who live in the communities, and the folks who control the work. And then we identify what levers are available and begin to use those levers to balance power so that we can start to invest in true partnership, take that next step of building an infrastructure out of that partnership, and then engage the relevant players in that partnership and the relevant resources devoted to that partnership to start to solve challenges in the shared interest, to equitably distribute resources, benefits, and burdens. And it becomes sort of a cycle that grows. Okay. So if we're thinking about balancing power in a regional labor market, for example, we might begin to ask questions like, is there balance or imbalance in the power of workers in the workplace, program, industry, sector, or community that I'm looking at, right? What impact does this have on access, information, resources, all of the things that I want to impact? Okay, so I've done my analysis and I start to look, well, how are these decisions being made? Where are the decision points here where power is or can be exerted? And who makes them? And what impact does that ultimately have? Okay, is it where I want to go, and is it the direction that of change that we want to make? If it's not, what levers are there that we can use to balance power, put the right folks at the table, meaning everybody who has a stake in the game, with a powerful role, so that decisions that are made are more likely to lead to this goal of equitably shared resources, benefits, and burdens? And what gaps are there? What levers what levers exist but we're not using, and how do we do that? And what impact would this have if we use them? And ultimately, what new levers do we need to create? Okay. So that's kind of the process work that is undertaken. And you know, we've got developing high road partnerships out there today that are really engaged in doing this work. Okay. Really key, important work. So there's a lot there to unpack. Let me stop for a minute and again open back up for some questions. Anybody have a burning question that they want to ask at this point?
Yes, actually I do.
Sure, please go ahead.
I'd be interested in knowing what legislative advocacy the Berkeley Center is looking at to help reset the erosion of worker power in some sort of balance with management, given the spike in CEO shareholders 1% of 1% net profit growth over COVID, and you know, I'm just curious how y'all see your role going forward.
Going forward in that. Yeah, well, as a labor center, we don't engage directly in legislative advocacy because we're a publicly funded university. Our role is really to I think, provide the analysis that folks who do legislative advocacy and community advocacy and use to look and understand really what's going on, right? So we provide a lot of analysis around the kinds of questions, Benita, that you're raising, as do other labor centers, and then provide support for identifying and developing the interventions that could make certain change, right? Do the kind of investigation that we're talking about today. But high road partnerships are often made up of partners, employers, unions, worker centers, and community advocacy groups who do that on the ground advocacy work, Benita. So that really is work that exists in the high road partnership space. It depends on sort of, and high road partners often wear different hats. They're in some spaces they're workforce development track professional, or doing workforce development track work, but at the same time they're also doing advocacy work. So your question is really important, and I think is important for the high road partnership space.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions out there? Okay, great. So let's take a moment now to look at what some of those levers that I'm talking about might be. And we're not going to have time today to do a real deep dive into those levers, but there's a great resource out there that can help you specifically dive into some of these. And we'll start with some some demand side levers. But to sort of set the stage, I'm sorry, if I'm blocking the slide there, to sort of set the stage of thinking about demand side levers, I think it's a great place to start to think about what are the minimum elements of job quality. Again, I won't go through this whole list because job quality, I think, is a much bigger list than what's here. But here are some basic elements. Everything, we often start with a living wage or higher relative, particularly to the industry, consistent, predictable hours, all of those kinds of things. Also things like, though, effective voice on the job, the ability to contribute to workplace decisions and redress grievances, and all the way into things like agency over the impact of our work on our community, right? If I'm a nurse, I may care a lot about the way my work is structured because I can see how it impacts quality of care to the people in my community that are relying on that, on my work. If I'm working in the refinery sector, I may care about the impact that my work is having or my industry is having on my community where my family lives and works. So when we think about pulling levers that affect job quality, we should think about what that really means. Pulling levers that change power relationships, where does that start in terms of the workplace? So do your own, develop your own ideas about what job quality really looks like. And as a community, I think a lot of folks are coming to the table with ideas around what job quality looks like. Some of that's embedded, I think, Phyllis, in some of your comments earlier. Consistency, consistent hours, a variety of things, who's bearing the burdens. And it's not just a particular job quality in particular occupations or jobs, but we also have to have fair and equal access to those jobs and fair and equal treatment once we get there. So it's kind of a big set of things that we need to be paying attention to impact job quality. And that can move us into thinking about what those levers look like. Here we go. Sorry. Some of the demand side levers that are really powerful and that many of you may already be familiar with are wage and benefit standards, right? Wage floors, prevailing wage approaches, skills standards, skill certifications, educational credentials and licenses. Where can those be applied in ways that push up job quality and start to balance power in labor markets? Responsible employer standards, licensing, bonding, compliance, records of past performance, project labor agreements and community workforce or community benefits agreements, hugely impactful. Inclusive procurement policies, those of you working in procurement areas or state agencies, are we including labor standards? Do we incentivize community benefit agreements when we procure services or goods? Are we seeking best-in-class employer measurements rather than just the lowest cost? Because somebody's bearing the burden for that lowest cost. Inclusive hiring approaches, local hire requirements, targeted hires, and community referral systems. Keeping work in the public sector, right, where there are protections, where there are existing wage floors, benefit standards, where power is a little bit more already in balance. And then, of course, measuring, monitoring, and holding folks accountable for all of those things. Because if we have them on paper, but we're not making them happen, then they don't have as much of an impact, obviously. Again, for a deeper dive, we could spend a whole session or more on just those, but I'd refer you all to my colleague Carol Zabin's report. She and her colleagues put together Putting California on the High Road, a Jobs and Climate Action Plan for 2030, and a series of related briefs that will help you take a deeper dive into some of those demand side levers. And it can be accessed here at this link. Okay. Let's also, Peter's being a little slow in moving. Wants to be stuck. There we go. Let's move into looking at some supply side levers. So The demand side levers are the ones that act on the sort of employer and work and industry side of the equation. Supply side levers act on or with workers or groups of workers to increase their power in the labor market. And again, to think about what's important, what kinds of levers are important on the supply side of the labor market, let's start by identifying the elements of job quality, or excuse me, the elements of what it takes to get and keep a good job. We want to increase worker power so that they have the greater power to impact how their work affects their quality of life in their community, but they have to get and succeed at that job at the same time. And high quality jobs are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a high road economy. So these are some of the things that we think about when we want to talk about what it takes to get and succeed at a job, right? Social capital, again, embedded in some of the comments that we heard earlier in our discussion. Information that the job exists and access to recruitment, right? Some whole communities are left out of information and recruitment. Communication mechanisms. You can't even apply if you don't have certain communication mechanisms. The ability to navigate coded information, right? The dominant culture has information coded in a certain way, and not every group in the culture has access to that coded information. And basic things like transportation, clothing, stable housing, you know, the sort of the usual list. And again, I won't go through these in detail, but it's really important that we invest some time thinking about what it really takes to get and keep a good job, including things like the ability to move freely in safety in our communities, ongoing support networks, etc. And then things like groups, certain standards or certain backgrounds, certain documents, work history, certain specific skills or languages, certifications, permits, background checks. All of those things are, again, part of the equation for workers to get and succeed at a job. And we need to ask ourselves whether these resources are equitably distributed and whether the standards, like work history standards, are equitably applied, and what effect that's having on worker power in the workplace, and whether historic and structural racism and discrimination has limited access to these resources for groups of people, for whom, what impact that's had. So that's part of the sort of analysis phase that we do as we move into balancing power. And from there, we can really start to talk about, okay, if this is our current context and we want to shift, what are some of the supply side levers that we can pull to move folks here, to build to increase worker power? And some of these are things that you'll see that those of us in the workforce development field are going to be more comfortable with. Some of these fall into our comfort zone. Access to information, access to resources, mechanisms through which worker voice can be heard, skills to exercise voice and power, work adjacent systems that meet needs, transportation systems that actually work for the workforce population, childcare systems that work, but also things that are less in our comfort zone, like connection to communities of interest. We can connect workers to institutions of power. We can connect workers to opportunities for collective action and collective bargaining. Make sure workers have a place in partnership and infrastructure. And then again, back to what's more into our comfort zone, provide readiness training and pre-apprenticeship, skills development, training, apprenticeship, and earn and learn models, certification and credentialing, and career pathways and skills upgrade work. Okay. So these are sort of a list of some of the supply side levers that we can pull as we do this work. And I think it's important to acknowledge, particularly when we're talking about workforce development work, that scaling the high road and really doing the high road at all, working on the high road at all, is about system change. It's not about helping one worker at a time. You know, our partners at the Workforce Board are really good at pointing out that the traditional workforce system has often been about fix the worker to make the worker suitable for some perceived employer need. And it hasn't gotten us where we want to go, right? Based on our own responses to our previous question. What we really need to be doing is to fix the system so that it works for both workers and employers, right? and community members, right? Because high road partnerships are really broader than now only workers and employers. It's about the whole community. So how do we do that at scale using these levers? It's a little bit easier to see how the demand side levers move to balance power at scale, right? Wage and benefit standards affect whole industries or whole sectors. Skills standards affect whole industries or sectors. Responsible employer standards affect whole geographic areas. So that's a little easier to see how that's impacting scale. But I also think it's possible to see how supply side levers impact things at scale. And since many of the folks that we work with are in the workforce development space and spend a lot of their time on supply side levers, I think I want to make sure that we acknowledge that so that we're intentional about using these levers in ways that help workers collectively balance power rather than just one worker at a time. Particularly the levers like connecting people to communities of interest or institutions of power. Embedding your work and engaging with worker centers, engaging with unions as we do workforce development work, engaging with community advocacy groups so that workers are together in communities of interest where they can share their needs and resources and experiences and then start to move that collectively into taking action around power. Connection to institutions of power. The workforce system itself, and many of the folks on this call, are part of institutions of power. So making connections with workers individually is one way to connect workers to institutions of power, but groups of workers through our work with high road partnerships connects workers to institutions of power and the resources that come with that. Collective action and collective bargaining, again, connecting workers to unions so that they can engage in taking action around their wages, hours, and working conditions. And making sure workers have a impactful place in partnership and infrastructure. So those are supply side levers that it's a little easier to see how they balance power at scale. And workforce development practices like access to information, resources, mechanisms through which voice can be heard, all these other things, they too can either be done in a way that is just one worker at a time, or they can be targeted to particularly invest in priority populations, those populations that have been really marginalized and have been blocked from access to those kinds of services and resources. So that too, if it's targeted appropriately, can move groups of workers collectively to a place where they can exercise power in a different way. Okay, let me take a quick pause there for any questions or comments that folks want to throw in. Silence is okay. I know this is a lot to think about. Okay. All right. So all of these really invite us, I think, to start thinking about new paradigms. And Phyllis, I think some of your comments earlier were pointing us toward a new paradigm for business, right? They really invite business to say, does it make sense to change the norms of how we as businesses respond to worker power? Are we missing an opportunity to mine the competitive advantage that shared power brings? If we go back all the way to that place where we started with Milberg and Houston's definition of the high road versus the low road, or description of the high road versus the low road, are we missing opportunities to innovate, anticipate, respond? You know, sort of like the example that we described in the Education Fund, the Kaiser Permanente and SEIU partnership. Because of that partnership, that sector was able to pivot and respond to the needs of the industry, the needs of the workers in the industry, and the needs of the community that the industry impacts. Without this kind of partnership, we're missing that ability to compete and innovate in that way. And it also attracts public investment and goodwill. So there are lots of goods to be found for businesses in this new sort of high road paradigm. In fact, I'll mention that we'd been contacted by some folks who were working with a group of CEOs, major CEOs from across the country, who said, "Yeah, we get it. Nothing's going to change if we have to change something in order to change something. And how can you help us think about new ways for businesses to engage with unions and workers?" That's an interesting sign, right? Because they recognize that they hold a whole lot of power, and if we all want the economy to be in a more equitable one, business is going to have to do something different. So I've got a set of slides on specific to how they can do that, but we've hidden them from this presentation in the interest of time. I think it also the high road also invites a new paradigm for workforce and economic development professionals. And I think that has a variety of steps. I think it starts with conditioning investment and measuring investment on meaningful development of high road infrastructure practices and results. Using resources to, whether it's foundation resources or public dollars, to invest in low road practices, or employers who are undertaking low road practices, simply doesn't make sense if our goal is a more equitable economy. And from there, I think we identify where high road partners and high road actors already exist. Again, in California, there are a variety of high road partnerships, starting with apprenticeship programs that have been around for a very long time, and partnerships that have been developed independently over a period of time. And now there's this incredible state investment in a targeted high road initiative. So the access to existing high road partners and high road access is larger than ever before. And I think workforce and economic development professionals need to be looking there. And when you find them, we need to then deepen our investment in those partnerships to enhance, expand, and accelerate the work as rapidly as possible. We can expand geographically, we can expand across sectors, we can expand across firms, across populations, priority populations as well. We also then, I think, need to spend some time identifying high road deserts. Where are the places in our state where there's little or no effective high road infrastructure? There aren't a lot of unions, there aren't any worker centers, where are those places? Because we can't ignore those places. In many cases, those are the sectors, the industries, or the regions where help is needed the most, or change is needed the most, I should say. Where there's limited use of demand side levers, where there are weak supply side levers. And we should look across the board, and certainly in high road deserts, to measure and articulate the real cost and impact of low road practices in those areas, right? Where there just aren't high road practices to look to. And then once we're there, we find, we learn from, and we develop community coalitions in those areas and across the board, really, that are working to create and institutionalize high road conditions. That is, who in those places are working to balance power and impact policy, right? That's where we'll find the beginnings of a potential new high road partnerships. And we need to then invest in those coalitions to build their capacity, to create that high road community who can do change, convey legitimacy on the work that they're doing from existing institutions of power, and to support them in developing an infrastructure that can then be leveraged to build emerging partnerships. And then we invest in those emerging partnerships. So we've got this virtuous cycle going on. So those are some ways to think about, as workforce and economic development professionals, some steps we can take to engage in this work. Okay. So from there, I just want to sort of let that sit for a minute and ask all of you to think about how you already are paving the high road in your work, because I'm sure you are, and how moving forward you will think about designing your work to pull existing levers and create new levers that balance power, create partnership, and build that infrastructure that then results in an equitable sharing of resources, benefits, and burdens. So that's where we are for the formal presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that I can see a little bit better and invite some more questions, comments, feedback, input, criticism.
Pam, a question I had, I put that in the chat too, somewhere. It's buried right now. So lately we've been hearing the terms high road job and high road economy. And we see that even in policy and legislation. So what I had in the chat is, when is it appropriate to use those terms? You know, high road economy and high road. And then what is that relationship to the high road training partnership?
I think that's a great question, Pradeep. And it's one of the things that I think a lot of high road practitioners struggle with when they hear the term high road being used. From my perspective, the term high road should be used, is most, let me say it this way, is most legitimately used when it relates to efforts to change that power balance, and using that change in power balance to move toward an economy that is equitable, where resources, benefits, and burdens are shared. I think it's often tempting to say, oh, this is a high road employer because or this is a high road project because we're putting people in jobs that pay X, right? And that's one element. But if those jobs, if there's no power mechanism, if there's no worker voice mechanism, worker shared power, then that's sort of a gift that can be taken away when something changes in the conditions of the labor market. So I'm not sure that's the best use of the term high road, for example. So it's not simply measured by, you know, okay, then everybody should be a lawyer, or everybody should be a this or that or the other, right? This is really about systems and system change that leads to long-term economic stability and economic health and economic equity, incorporates the equity, climate, and job quality principles over time. That is not something that's taken away when an economic shock happens or when competitive strategies start to change. The second part of your question is how does that relate to the initiative? I think the initiative is a place where that's really understood. And I think within the state, for example, it's a place where professionals who've been doing this work, high road work, and really sort of building out this analysis for a long time exist. And so it's a great place to sort of check in when we try to do high road work to say, is this high road, right? Are we really meeting all the needs of high road partnerships? So that's one way to think about that. And I would just keep referring people back, come back to these principles. Are we making change around power? How are we pulling levers that will allow people to make that change sustainably, right? So that the power is owned in the communities and is sustainable.
Can I just add to that, Pam?
Please, Magali.
Yeah, I think especially with regard to the first part of your comments, I think that's right. Like the power change is central to all of this. And at the core of that is the partnership, right? Like a genuine partnership between folks on both the demand and supply side, right? And so I think that's how it's manifested, right? If you see, like, for example, one of the initial demonstration projects, CTW, when you see them in the room, you see that there's a genuine relationship happening there, even if they're not being asked questions about high road and work that they're doing. You know, that's how much they've invested in that relationship and really getting on the same page about working together and working toward like these industry solutions that they've set out for themselves.
Magali, I think that's really, really exactly right and very, very helpful. And let me take the opportunity to point out that Magali and her team at the UCLA Labor Center have done some great work around evaluation of the High Road Training Partnership initiatives. And there was just, I don't know if this is going to be available for viewing in the future, but earlier today presented some of that work to the California Workforce Development Board, highlighted by presentations from the Education Fund, the Ed Fund, and the California Transit Works folks that really, at a very practical level, demonstrates how this works, right? So I refer you to that work. It's really terrific stuff.
Pam, it's available on our YouTube channel, so it will be there.
That's terrific.
Assuming the recording went well.
There's always that possibility of a hitch. Yeah, that was a great presentation. We were saying at the start of this, of our conversation today here, that it's a great companion piece, right? So we're sort of diving into the kind of, I don't know, theoretical underpinnings of high road work, ways to think about it as we design things. And the presentation earlier today for the Workforce Board was really very practical and really very concrete, with some great examples. I credit the Workforce Board in bringing, the Workforce Board is funding all of this work, and so it's bringing all that together as part of this initiative.
I included the link to the YouTube channel. It has not been posted yet, but that's the link to the CWDB YouTube channel in the chat.
Excellent. That's just great. And if you look at the High Road Partnerships Initiative page at the Workforce Board, it'll take you to the list of initiatives and descriptions of, the list of existing currently funded High Road Partnership projects and descriptions of what they're doing. There's also a terrific map for those of you who are working regionally. You know, one of the recommendations I made was to find the existing High Road Partnerships where you're working. Well, there's a map that'll show you right where the funded ones are. There are others in your community, apprenticeship programs and others as well, but that's a great place to start. Let's see, we've got a question from Wendy. One challenge with High Road Training Partnerships is that employer partners, for a variety of reasons, do not fulfill commitments to hire trained workers. The partnerships start with available jobs. Workers go through a customized training based on employer needs, as well as a whole person case management, both during training and OJT, but then the expected hiring doesn't happen. What incentives or other strategies have helped or could help overcome this challenge? I think that's a really great question, Wendy. So it may, I don't know specifically what partnerships you're referring to. It takes me back to 2 points that commenters made. One, Pradeep's point is, when is it appropriate to use the high road language and when is it not? We might want to really look at, is that really a high road partnership? I don't know. And use the opportunity to say, okay, what's missing? Are all of the essential elements being fully engaged in this partnership? And if not, what can we do to correct that, to change that? And then to Magali's point, that partnership really is the key. And so it's time, it says it's time to go back to the table with those partners, because if there was a commitment, I'm looking back at your question again, if there's a partner at the table who made a commitment that isn't being fulfilled, then that's where we've got to go back to that engaged partnership and say, this isn't happening. That's not real partnership. What's going on here? And if that's done in a skillful manner, we may find out that there are some reasons behind that. Something's changed, then we can start to address those reasons, right? That's why that partnership work consistently happening, even when there's not a crisis, is key and critical. We've got other practitioners on the call. Does anybody else want to answer that? Has anybody else come up with or faced this problem or come up with a strategy to address commitments that aren't met, particularly around hiring? And Wendy, did you have any more that you wanted to add to your question? Okay. All right. Any other comments, questions, criticisms? You know, it's where are we going wrong? We want to learn from each other in these conversations always. Did I see, we had a question from Benita Steele. Oh, I see. Is there a case study you can share where high roads approaches have been significantly improved in areas of high road deserts? Again, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I think there's somebody who on this call who's doing that work right now. And it's not written up yet as a case study, but stay tuned, I think. I'd also say, sort of historically, I'd go back to something that's like a high road desert or has a similar situation, and that is when the decline of the manufacturing sector in this country, as you all probably recall, was devastating. And that was devastating in places that had been used to really family sustaining jobs, kind of middle class jobs, particularly in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt, right? Which then became the Rust Belt. And the Center on Wisconsin Strategy has been using high road approaches for years to address the challenges that came out of that devastation. So it wasn't initially a high road desert, but I do think that it had similar dynamics, having come from you know, what was high road work, and then having lost all of that to start to build that back up. It's probably true to say that the skills that people in those communities had developed over time helped them build that high road in a way that maybe is less available in a place where that work's never been done at all or hasn't been done for many, many years. But that's one example. Let me see if, Blanca, do you have any comments that you would raise on that? I said I wasn't going to put somebody on the spot, so.
So I think our project is very much based on creating, I guess, that space within the logistics industries. And we are trying to currently potentially put a case study behind it. So not just so that we're working on the project, but we can put research behind understanding the processes, including the agreements with the labor management agreements. I know that it was highlighted earlier that usually HRTPs are initially kicked off with agreements that are set in place. And I think for our case, in our case specifically, that's something that we are working on developing simultaneously to our HRTP project. Yeah.
Yeah, Blanca and her team are doing really extraordinary work in the high road space. So, as are really all of the projects.
Pam, this has been very excellent. I mean, I am so happy for this. It's, you know, it's always nice to hear something when you leave with more knowledge than less. You know, but I have, as you were talking, I have a thought, because as you know that as we move forward, there's going to be a lot of I mentioned this morning, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in the high road work. So the thought I had, and I sort of looked at, you know, maybe in 3 buckets: planning, emerging, mature, or established. So the question I have is, all of the supply side and demand side levers you have, you could take 2 approaches. All of them have to be there, but it could be like on a scale 1 to 5 or 0 to 5, and you sort of tick off. Or are there certain sets of those that, that sort of describe you as a planning HRTP, and it's in, and then you add from that into emerging and into mature. I mean, I just wanted to know anyone on the panel, particularly yours, and thoughts on that.
I think that's really a smart and thoughtful way to approach thinking about this. There certainly are, and there's probably no sort of exact formula that these 5 always go here and these 3 always go here and these 7 always mean, that. But for example, a lot of many of the supply side levers aren't going to necessarily be meaningful or relevant to a developing partnership, where the conversations are about, can we work together? How? What does that mean? Are you going to commit to hiring? Are you going to commit to providing A, B, and C? So providing transportation to, priority populations isn't necessarily part of the conversation then, until that partnership is down the road and actually providing services in a different way. So yeah, I think that's valuable. It could potentially, and probably is something that we can use as we continue to learn from high road partnerships, who's using what when. I do think it's probably also always valuable when supporting the development of high road partnerships and when helping them try to solve problems, to go back to those lists and say, are you using any of these levers? And if you're not, is there a reason why, and how can we support you in using those levers? And we'll also learn from them. They're going to figure out other levers that we haven't even thought about and teach us, and then they'll teach each other in the community of practice. But really great approach. Okay. Any other questions that I'm missing from the chat or in the Berkeley Labor Center's got a case study that'll be coming out in the next couple of months on one high road partnership, and it has a lot of elements of the kinds of coalitions around high road partnerships that make meaningful change in shifting power in industries or supporting power in industries. So look forward to that. The consortium of Workforce Board, UCLA Labor Center, UC Berkeley Labor Center, folks at Merced and Riverside are working to continue to develop resources and understanding about the high road that we'll share with you all over time. But unless anybody's got some more burning comments or questions, we might be able to have a few extra unplanned minutes.
Pam, will you share this recording with us?
Absolutely. Yep. We'll send it through a little editing to make sure it's all straightforward, and then we'll share it with folks. All right. Well, thanks everybody for your time, and I hope to see you all again in a future conversation. There's a lot more to talk about.